everyone. Welcome to Risk Roundup. It is not just the United States, across nations, people are more afraid than ever before. The growing fear has many reasons. For instance, human security is under serious threat as COVID-19 pandemic is nowhere near to be over. Moreover, industries are collapsing. In the United States, the 2020 election was also contested. As societal unrest grows, the world is moving towards tribalism. Fear now dominates for and from government, institutions, freedom, politics, media, big tech, free speech, health, jobs, economy, survival, and security. Therefore, it is necessary to evaluate the why, how, and when of how people perceive fear. It is crucial to understand the science of fear. To discuss the science of fear that helps us understand the growing fight or flight response, I'm honored to welcome Professor John S. Torday to Risk Roundup. Professor Torday is a development physiologist from UCLA with a strong interest in how and why physiology has evolved. Welcome, Professor Torday. We are so delighted to have you on Risk Roundup.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, Professor. Glad to have you here again. The term fight or flight represents the choices that we have when we are faced with danger in our environment. This environment can be for our societal security, economic security, national security, and more. The choices are limited as we could either fight or flee. Today, more and more people are ready to fight on all available platforms and domains. We know that the fight or flight response has been around since the dawn of man, since the beginning of humankind. But we are only just learning about its physiology and psychology. It seems we have reached a point where we need to evaluate the science of fear, the science of flight or fight response that we are witnessing. Risk group community and I look forward to your thoughts on this crucial topic of science of fight or flight. So especially the biology that you have understood over the years that brings out the best and worst in us. Please share your thoughts and presentation.
Thank you.
Go ahead, please.
So the title of this talk is Human Evolution, Fight, Flight, or Problem Solve. Next slide, please. So we know from both fossil evidence and from genomics a great deal about human migration out of the Rift Valley in Africa some 150, 200,000 years ago. Some humans went north towards Europe through the Middle East, others went eastward. And then it becomes a bit more complicated. But I'm just going to focus on the migration northward into Europe as the basis for the evolution of Western European civilization. The hormone that determines the fact that we are warm-blooded, only mammals and birds are warm-blooded, is the hormone oxytocin. And I show that in this slide. And that was a great driver for the migration northward because it allowed us to go further and further north into colder and colder climates. But importantly, oxytocin has many, many effects on human behavior, among them being, it's referred to as the love hormone. If you treat a feral dog with oxytocin within seconds, literally, it becomes domesticated. And so this is a great effector of human behavior and the origins of our civilization. And that's what I want to address is where have we gone wrong in this age of COVID? Next slide, please. So here I show the relationship between the fight or flight mechanism and oxytocin as the alternative to the fight or flight mechanism in a sense. And that oxytocin, as I said, it's driven migration, human imagination, and ultimately our civilization, and I will explain that as I go along. COVID-19 has actually undermined this relationship such that our history, sociology, and technology no longer are the basis for our behaviors. It's now the virus that's telling us how to react to one another and and as a community of human beings. Next slide, please. So the scientific method, which has been in existence for 500 or 600 years now, has given us insight to our being based on observation and experimentation. Next slide. John Archibald, the well-known cosmologist, in his retrospective look at astronomy, cosmology, and the human condition, he came up with this idea of a participatory universe as a self-excited circuit, which is diagrammed here. So basically, he's saying that the cosmos is looking at us, and we in turn look at the cosmos, and that this is the essence of our being. So it's a very metaphysical concept, and an interesting one coming from a hard scientist like Wheeler. Next slide, please. Art, on the other hand, can also give us insight to our being, though only intuitively, not in a testable and refutable way, which are Popper's criteria for what science really should be. It should both be testable scientifically, and if false, it should be refutable. Next slide. So here we have Rene Magritte's painting, Do Not Reproduce. We're looking at someone looking in a mirror from the back of their head. And so this is the observer and the observing. This is essentially the artist's version of what Wheeler had concluded, this relationship between the cosmos and the individual and how we interrelate with one another on a cosmic scale and on a human scale at the same time. Next slide, please. So the prevailing concept theory of how we have developed and evolved is referred to as the Endosymbiogenesis theory, which was put forward by Lynn Margulis, a professor of mine in college, and then a colleague when I was at Harvard Medical School a number of years ago. And Lynn's concept, which she didn't actually originate, but which she really put on the map, if you will, was that the way that we evolved, if we're going from unicellular organisms from left to right, was the endogenization of factors in the environment that posed us an existential threat. So the classic example is iron, which is the most prevalent, common mineral in the Earth's crust, for example. Iron is a very potent oxidizing agent, but in our physiology, it forms the core of the heme protein in red blood cells that allows for the transport of oxygen around through the circulation and to the various tissues to oxygenate. And there are many examples of these factors in the environment. Oxygen is another. Heavy metals, ions, bacteria themselves, which became mitochondria, the energy source of our cells, for example. So this is a well-known phenomenon. And then when we went from unicellular to multicellular organisms, we evolved the capacity for cellular communication. So starting with a fertilized egg here on the left, a zygote, we see this energy flow from the zygote to the various stages of the embryo as it divides in 2, 4, 8, 16, etc. And the mechanism that underlies that process is mediated by these these growth factors and their signaling. But the signaling is actually constituted by high energy phosphates. So what we're actually witnessing is a transfer of energy from one cell to the other until we are born, and then during the entire arc of our life cycle, it's all a function of energy transfer. And that energy transfer actually emanates from the origins of the cosmos, the Big Bang, which is thought to have started in a singularity, one huge entity, which then basically blew up. And we, both the physical and the organic aspects of existence, have been trying to reassemble that singularity in a sense ever since. This is what what drives our life cycle. So next slide, please. So in the beginning, there were lipids, fat, and water that were delivered to the Earth's surface by these snowball-like asteroids that contained those lipids, and water, the frozen snowball asteroids. And the reason the asteroids were able to strike the surface of the Earth is because there was no atmosphere and no oxygen in the atmosphere to oxidize these asteroids, as is the case now. And sure enough, the artists are always ahead of the curve in terms of the science. And Robert Frost, in one of his notebooks, stated that life is that which can mix oil and water. And he's actually exactly right, except that he had no experimental evidence for it. That's where the advantage of science allows for connecting Frost's metaphor with other aspects of the human condition. Next slide. So about 500 million years ago, a greenhouse effect due to rising levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere generated by plant life caused an increase in atmospheric temperature, partially drying up the ocean, uncovering the Earth's surface in part. So we had land masses. The rise in the atmospheric temperature also decreased the amount of oxygen dissolved in water, because the ability of oxygen of any gas to dissolve in water is a function of how warm or cold the water is. And the warmer it is, the less gas can be dissolved. So that drove so-called bony fish with a bony skeleton, out of water onto land. Next slide. Neil Shubin discovered this organism, or the fossil remains of this organism, which he called Tiktaalik, which he published in 2004. And this was the first hard evidence, pardon the pun, so it literally is fossilized evidence for a transitional organism from fish to land-dwelling organisms, which was very important, because then it offered the opportunity to ask how and why that occurred. Next slide. So the swim bladder of bony fish evolved into the lungs of land vertebrates, in contradistinction to the way we've thought about that for many, many decades, and that is that it was the gills that actually gave rise to the lung by analogy, because both mediate the uptake of oxygen. That turns out not to be the case with genomic information. So the swim bladder, which is responsible for maintaining the buoyancy of the fish, allowing it to float at different levels in the water for feeding or for sleeping, for that matter, and everything in between. So the swim bladder gave rise to the lung in the progression from amphibians, frogs, to reptiles, birds, and mammals as we migrated out of water and adapted to land. The process of lung evolution was a stepwise process resulting from the cell-cell interactions I mentioned in the previous slide, in the 2 slides ago, I'm sorry, triggered by periods of hypoxia, lack of adequate oxygen for metabolism. In other words, the lung is evolving in a stepwise fashion, and periodically it can't keep up with the demand of metabolism of the organism, and so the organism becomes oxygen poor. Hypoxia is the most potent stimulus of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, increasing adrenaline production by the adrenal gland, relieving the limitation for oxygenation by increasing surfactant production by the alveoli, the tiny air sacs of the lung, allowing them to distend because of the stimulation by adrenaline of surfactant, which is a soapy material that is present in all of these air sacs. And that, in turn, transiently, just for the moment, allowed for increased oxygenation by allowing the air sacs to distend further. That was kind of a stopgap measure. Next slide. So here's the diagram of what I'm talking about. I will start here on the far left. This hypoxic condition, the decreased oxygen in the environment, caused stress, physiologic stress on the system, which caused the pituitary gland, a small walnut-sized organ at the base of the brain, to produce ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and that in turn stimulates. So here's the adrenal gland, the cortex, and the medulla, the triangular-shaped cortex and the rectangular-shaped medulla. And ACTH then stimulates cortisol production, hydrocortisone, which you can buy over the counter these days. And the cortisol then finds its way through the microcirculation of the medulla and stimulates adrenaline production. And that adrenaline production then acted on the lung, on the evolving lung, to allow for increased surfactant, which I show here on the right side of that lung. And the surfactant, as I said, allows for this transient increase in the size of the alveoli, so that there's a greater surface area for gas exchange. As a side effect of that, The adrenaline also causes the disruption of fat cells in this periphery of the organism, fat pads, and that releases free fatty acids from these fat cells. And free fatty acid is is the most efficient substrate fuel for generating body heat. So as a consequence of this cycle, there was an increase in body temperature. And that was the origin of our being warm-blooded, being able to regulate our own body temperature independently of the temperature of the atmosphere, as cold-blooded organisms are dependent upon. So, a little lizard comes out in the morning and has to warm up by the sun in order to be able to start to be able to move around and catch, insects, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have to do that. We can just get up and go. So that's a huge advantage in terms of the mobility we have. Next slide. So here's a somewhat complicated slide, but if I start at the bottom, the origins of life actually were these lipid molecules that I mentioned earlier have been delivered to the Earth by these snowball-like asteroids. And when those lipid molecules are immersed in water, they're called amphiphiles. They have a positive and a negative charge at either end of this molecule. The negatively charged end is soluble in water. The positively charged end sticks up into the air, and it actually is literally perpendicular to the water. That was the beginnings of life for us as vertebrates, and those lipid molecules then formed micelles. These spheres formed by a number of lipid molecules forming a semi-permeable membrane around distinguishing the outside of the cell from the inside of the cell. And the reason that occurred was because when these lipid molecules align themselves in the surface of the water, they're able to reduce the surface tension of water, and that's what allowed for these micelles to have appeared. They in turn gave rise to what's called niche construction. That is, as I mentioned earlier, these cells are evolving by internalizing or endogenizing factors in the environment. And so the niche construction is the idea that there's this continuum from what the cell content, in terms of these factors from the environment, forming our physiology as a continuum with the ecosphere that they're in. So there's a continuum from the inside of the cell to the outside. And that in turn gave rise to multicellular organisms, and to warm-bloodedness or endothermy, which allowed for us to stand on two legs. It's referred to as bipedalism. This was a huge advantage in terms of human evolution. Only birds and humans stand naturally on two legs. Sure, dogs can do it, but that's just a trick. We do it naturally and spontaneously. The importance of bipedalism is that it gave rise to the ability to make tools and to form language, because you freed the forelimbs to do so. And intermediate to the bipedalism and the tool-making and language was the evolution of the genetic control of body temperature by the posterior pituitary hormone oxytocin. So this is another hormone that's made in the pituitary gland, and it signals through dopamine for a whole constellation of human behavioral characteristics, amongst the primary of which is imagination, the ability to conceive of what you could do with once your forelimbs were freed, for making spear tips, for written language, the generation of the movable type by Gutenberg, the mechanization of language or written language as a tool, which ultimately gave rise to civilization. And civilization, in turn, feeds back on this system. It creates a safe haven for imagination, for generation of tools, human discourse, talking about what it is like to be human, and to literally generate civilization. And that all feeds back on this system such that we have modern society, if you will. So next slide, please. This is a series of clicks. So if I start here at the bottom with these lipid molecules giving rise to the first principles of physiology, overlaid by physiologic stress, of the water to land transition and the generation of adrenaline, we have an increase in oxygenation and metabolism and warm-bloodedness, and ultimately bipedalism, walking on two legs, freeing the forelimbs, ability to make tools. And language, again, is a form of tool making. If you have subject, object, bracketing the verb in a sentence, that's basically making, cobbling together a thought that generates language, and then conversation, and then you have written language in terms of words, sentences, paragraphs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a commonality here between the forelimbs generating, allowing for tool making and language. Next slide. And ultimately, you have the advent of modern human beings. And the sidelight to this is the origins of this is in this stress-related mechanism for transitioning from water to land. So this is a somewhat complicated slide. I may actually not go through all of it. It's basically what I just said with a few more doodads stuck onto it. But here, if you focus on the fact that oxytocin was critically important once we transitioned from water to land and became bipedal, one of the critical factors here is the formation of a lipid coat. Think of a piece of electrical wire, a copper wire, and around it there's insulation. That's what myelin is. Myelinization was critically important in the further evolution of the central nervous system and the conduction of calcium waves, which are the way that our brains and both the central and peripheral nervous system work. But that all gave rise ultimately to what we think of as civilization. And I'm showing here how it feeds back on this system in a positive feedback fashion. So there's this intimate relationship between civilization, societal organization, and all of these physiologic principles that go to make us as human beings up and allowing us to live in civilization. So next slide, please. So here on the left, I'm showing the evolution of man from great apes. In all likelihood, humans are actually juvenile great apes for many reasons that I won't delve into, but suffice it to say that there is a lineage here. And the critical factor is the ability to stand on two legs and the presence of a prehensile thumb and the ability to make tools and language. The reason I feel strongly that this is correct, and I'm working backwards here, is that there is actually an area in the cerebral cortex of the human brain, the area of Broca, which actually is where tool making and language reside, the ability to make tools and to form language, and ultimately to combine those two for written language. So, for example, if someone has a stroke, they lose both their facility in terms of their motor skills and also language for this very reason. But this is the mediator of this tool-making language phenomenon, and ultimately, as I say here, the generation of movable type, and it's underpinned by this driver of oxytocin coming from the posterior pituitary, generating human imagination, which then interplays with these properties in order to, so for example, the Gutenberg press for movable type actually emanated from a wine press. So how clever was that to move from making wine to making printed words? Pretty clever. But that's what civilization is all about, is taking different concepts and merging them, mashing them together and coming out with some novel innovation or thought process. And I don't distinguish between a novel idea and a novel technology. They're all one of a kind. Next slide. And so now here I'm going to contrast the fight or flight mechanism, which all vertebrates have this capacity. I'll contrast that with problem solving, which is unique, I believe, to humans. Yes, there are ways that you can teach an old dog new tricks, but these are just behaviors. They're not really thought processes. So fight or flight is stimulated by fear, which, as I said earlier, it stimulates cortisol production by the adrenal cortex. And for example, during pregnancy, cortisol will go from the mother to the infant, the developing embryo. And we know that if cortisol levels are too high, they are known to cause depression. both in us and in our offspring. So you get chronic depression across generations if you have unmitigated, fear-dominated conditions. And that leads to, the French term is anomie, the sense of, it's basically depression. It's basically depression, and it leads to authoritarianism, because if you are depressed, you won't come up with novel ideas, you won't be able to think for yourself, and therefore the political system will shift from a democratic to an authoritarian condition. Conversely, with problem solving, we have oxygen driving these hormones in the brain, such as endorphins. We all are probably familiar with the endorphin high that you experience when you're a long-distance runner, as a result of which you don't feel much physical pain after a while. The vasopressin, which is the partner of oxytocin, it has other interesting features which probably underpinned the movement of humans out of the Rift Valley towards the east, but I don't have enough time to discuss that. But there are similarities between the effect of oxytocin on Western European culture and vasopressin on Asian culture that are very deep and very ancient. But these neuroendocrine hormones give rise to creativity, imagination, and ingenuity, and ultimately to civilization, which then, as I've repeatedly said, feeds back on the system in a synergistic way to improve and to capitalize on the benefit of a civilized society in terms of creativity, innovation, ingenuity, all the things that we hold dear as a society, as citizens of this country. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about epigenetic inheritance. That's different from genetic inheritance in that these are changes in the readout of the DNA in the nuclei of our cells, that it doesn't change the code, it modifies it. So the organism acts as an agent for obtaining information from its environment, which is different from the way we normally think of ourselves as phenotypic organisms with certain traits. No, the actual mission we have is to obtain information from an ever-changing environment, which is a given. Our environment is constantly changing, and basically, if you think about the fact that the moon is either came from the same sources that the Earth did, or the other theory of how the moon came about was it was ripped from the Earth. But the point being that it acts as a counterbalance to the Earth, which sits at a 43-degree axial tilt, which generates the seasons. And the moon, in turn, stabilizes the axial tilt. And also, the phases of the moon also have influence on organisms living on the surface of the Earth. And so we probably are unique. There are many other Earths, but apparently our moon is the only one that is as large as to be able to have that stabilizing effect on our Earth. So the data acquired by the organism as an agent is incorporated into the egg and the sperm of the parent organism in the ovaries and testes. Only those data that are relevant are incorporated. We don't know how this mechanism actually functions at the level of making the determination as to which DNA codes are being modified by this epigenetic mechanism. But my laboratory at UCLA is actively studying this under funding from the NIH, because it's probably the black matter of biology. So the determinants of the relevance of any given gene are the truths of the organism's history. This is where truth biologically resides. This is how and why truth is essential in order for us to maintain this epigenetic mechanism. And without that kind of ability to determine what is true, we become disoriented and are at risk for becoming extinct, or alternatively following false data, which essentially is a larger arc of becoming extinct anyway. So this is the threat that we're under. Next slide. So here's my synthesis of all this, again, with the fight or flight mechanism and the relationship to oxytocin migration northward to Western Europe, all facilitated by human imagination and the generation of Western European civilization, undermined by the COVID-19 infectious process, by the pandemic, which, in my opinion, has led to tribalism instead of civilization. So all of this history and sociology and technology I'm showing here that underpins this process and has this feedback effect on our physiology and our well-being has been undermined. And the longer we allow that to occur, the less likely we are to get back to a civilized condition and away from a tribal kind of mentality. Next slide. So tribalism and civilization are in a fine balance. And the question is, which of these will win out? I think we have the opportunity to correct for a mid-course correction. But as I was discussing with Professor Pandya, the challenge is that we cannot go back to the same old, because we know that that's not effective. So the question is, what do we do the day after COVID-19? Next slide. And so the question is this a beginning? It's my hope. It's why I've shared these ideas. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Torday. It was an excellent presentation. I was thinking about the point that you made about the energy transfer and how the information is absorbed inside the cell. Now, because we are witnessing the collapse of objectivity and there is a rise in partisanship and there is rise in propaganda, the information coming from all different outlets, there are so many different media outlets now, and there is a democratization of communication. So there is, amidst the flow, enormous flow of information coming, disinformation and misinformation that is coming, how does it impact the humans in how they absorb the information, how that information is processed internally, and how the energy flow impacts their behavior? Because as we are witnessing, the behavioral issues are growing on the social media, and it is not only just the social media, it's irrespective of whether the behavior is expressed in a very violent way on social media or outside in the real world. The boundaries are blurring. So what reasons do you see, or what is at the root of these behavioral issues and the energy flow that we are witnessing, that is becoming more and more violent, and it's expressed in form of violence? Where do you see that taking us, as a human society, as a civilization?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess I would start with David Bohm, the great, one of Einstein's students. He was a physicist. And Bohm was of the opinion that we actually live in a subjective world of our own making, with our senses having evolved to survive. But that in reality, there is a true reality beyond our reach. So he called that the Implicat Order. We live in the explicate order. And the trick, our purpose is always to experiment, to challenge our environment, either through pure science or through literature or through art or through music. It's all or even sport. These are all experiments we're conducting, and those allow us to bridge from this subjective explicate world that we have of our own making to the truth, if you will, to the true hierarchical relationships in the cosmos, which do exist. And so your question, I think, is answered by that, in the sense that up until not that long ago, there was a synchrony between what we thought was true and what we were being taught and what we experienced. There was a little bit of a disconnect. I wrote a paper with František Beluška, a botanist in Germany, saying the reason we accept in science, in biologic science, we accept the fact that there may be as much as a 5% error in our experimental results just because that's the way, because biology is sloppy. But in reality, it's because we don't really understand it's not physics, it's not mathematics, it's biology. But we don't really understand that. We just accept it. We're always approximating. And we'll never be, by the way, we will never enter the implicate realm, because we'll always be at what's referred to in mathematics as an asymptote, because we began in an ambiguity. This is Schrodinger's idea about in his book, What is Life, which he published in 1944, he said, as a physicist, in reality, life, the driving force of life is this, what's referred to as negative entropy, a negative energetic state, which is the opposite of what happens in the environment. In the environment, thermodynamically, if you have a heat source, it will dissipate until it reaches, it all evens out. We don't do that biologically within us. That's what our life force is. So we always exist in an ambiguity, and that's why we're never going to achieve the pure implicate state. That's not our purpose. Our purpose is always to strive for it and to remain at least in sync with, or even perhaps ahead of the curve of, this constantly changing environment. I hope that makes sense. So the way I see the answer to what you're asking is, we had at least a lowercase t sense of truth, and we strove for the uppercase case T with capital T truth as our driving force. But that's no longer the case. We're being undermined by our technology, by the narcissistic feedback that we get from our own computers and from various sources, and we pick and choose, but they're dissociated from the laws of nature, which is really, so that's another important idea, and that is, I think that consciousness is not, the conversation in our heads. That's not what mind is. Our consciousness is the same set of principles that the cosmos is based upon, the same laws of nature, and we are being dissociated from that relationship. That's what the problem is. We have to get back to that kind of way of understanding who we are, how we are, why we are, based upon principles and not upon subjective conjecture.
Yes, no, I hear you. And we are living in an entangled system, right? I mean, everybody is connected to each other, and irrespective of where we are. Now, when I look, your point about imagination is absolutely right on, because what we have created in this world is, most of our systems and most of the reality in which we exist today is based on our imagination. And everything we create is based on our new ideas and ability to imagine new ways of doing things. Now, when we look at the fight or flight response that our ancestors had, in ancient time, since the beginning of the human civilization, not many, that in those days, there was nothing more like, property or possessions that people would worry about protecting. They would be traveling everywhere. They would just pick up whatever tools they have with them, and they would survive one day here, one day there. But the reality today is very different. People live in a civilized society. People have homes, people have jobs, people have their roots, and now when they face the enormous security risk that they are facing, as we see today, nobody is sure about whether they'll survive, COVID-19 pandemic. Nobody is sure whether they will have jobs in the coming tomorrow, whether they'll be able to provide for their family. So this is just a figure of speech, when I say nobody, it's a lot of people are really, really scared about what is coming their way, about what is going to happen to them, to their children, whether they will have any sense of economic, financial security, or any security in cyberspace. There are many growing challenges. Pandemic was the tip of the iceberg. So amidst all this new emerging reality, when every one of us has roots, has, family to protect, have loved one to protect, how is this fight or flight response going to take shape in the coming tomorrow? Because we cannot just leave behind everything and run to another country. We all live in this country. If we talk about United States, we are all part of United States. Now if there are challenges growing here, it's not like people will start picking up what they have and go move to another country. So we have to solve problems. We have to solve problems in a civilized manner, thinking that we are all fellow citizens. But this fight or flight response that we are witnessing, that is growing very rapidly, where both sides, all the sides, are willing to give their life for the cause that they believe in. What form do you see this new response mechanism, or rather the old response mechanism, evolving into?
Well, I think we need a paradigm shift. Our orientation, well, first of all, we've been undermined by the current political structure. We're told that, facts are whatever you want to believe. That's ridiculous. Facts are facts. So I think we've artificially been forced into this fight or flight condition away from problem solving. We have to re-embrace the logic of problem solving. But the problem is that the logic we're using is really antiquated. For example, I think that Marx probably was right in terms of his concept of dialectic materialism, but he focused on the wrong thing. It's actually dialectic energism. Energy is really the form that things in the cosmos actually are contingent on, not matter. Matter is, as Alfred North Whitehead said, that his process philosophy was grounded in the idea that it's really just energy transfers. Matter is an epiphenomenon, and I know that that's hard to get our minds around, but we put huge emphasis on material. If we're going to take risk, we want material return. There was a time in this country when you could do things from an altruistic perspective. It wasn't, I got into science because we had discovered an important principle in human biology that salvaged most premature infants don't die anymore. They used to die by the dozen. Usually, if an infant were born prematurely, it died. Prior to the late 1960s, when this discovery was made, which I won't delve into. But my point being that the work that was done was purely because it was the right thing to do. It was purely altruistic. And altruism is really gone by the wayside. We don't do anything if it's not to our benefit, materially in particular. And I think we have to begin to realize that it's interesting that there's this dichotomy between Western and Eastern attitudes towards individualism versus the group. There's probably someplace in between that is realistic in terms of how we comport ourselves moving forward. And I'm sure you know that the CIA put out a report back in the mid-'70s predicting exactly what's happening in society today as a consequence of climate change. So, there are these causal relationships that have to be addressed in some sort of a systematic way to get back to somewhat of a sense of normalcy. It doesn't have to be a total revamping, but we just have to get back to we're being dissociated. There's a very strong relationship between geochemistry and geophysics that I've demonstrated in terms of lung evolution genetically in a paper I wrote. But with climate change and the injection of so much energy into the environment, it is dissociating our evolution from our environment. That's clearly unhealthy. That has to be rectified. So
yes, absolutely. We have, in fact, we have at risk group, we have addressed that in our risk report that we just released. That is, protecting the planetary health is at the top of our agenda, and we have also given an explanation why we need to be focused on that, because everything is connected. If we are looking at the health of the planet and health of human beings, there is a connection between that. So every pandemic also is an ecological disease. So there is a lot that we need to understand and address. So thank you so much, Professor Torday, for participating in this roundup today. We appreciate your thoughtful insight into the science of fear and the fight of flight. Our global viewers and listeners would benefit tremendously from what you had to say today. And as a result, this risk roundup dialogue has been of service, and we thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Risk Group is a strategic security risk research platform and community. And through the Risk Roundup initiative, Risk Group and I are on a mission to talk with a billion people, innovators, scientists, entrepreneurs, futurists, technologists, policymakers to decision makers. The reason behind this effort is to research, review, rate, and report strategic security risk facing humanity. Thank you for being part of the conversation. Until next time, I'm Jayashree, host of Risk Roundup, signing off. See you next time. Thank you.